You're scrolling through social media and you see the news. Another person has been shot. And before you can even process it, your feed begins to explode. One side is declaring the victim a hero, a martyr, a proof of everything that's wrong with them. And then the other side starts digging into their past and finding reasons why maybe this isn't so simple. And then within hours, sometimes even within minutes, the shooting itself has become background noise to a war between two tribes. This is what we saw happen with the shooting of Charlie Kirk, and then just a few months later, the shooting of Renee Good. They were different victims, but the pattern was the same. The issue wasn't the violence. The issue was which side could weaponize the tragedy more effectively. And you're exhausted by this. You care about these issues. You care about human life. But somehow you're being asked to pick a side in tribal warfare rather than address the actual problem. So standing against identifies enemies. It draws lines between us and them. It creates avatars, simplified versions of people that can be easily attacked. And it feels powerful to stand against. I mean, you're taking a stand. And you know who the bad guys are. But here's what is actually happening. Standing against turns human beings into obstacles, issues into identity markers, and tragedy into weapons. Now, standing for articulates values. It names what you're working toward, what you want to create, and invites conversation rather than drawing battle lines. But standing for is harder. It requires you to articulate what you actually want, not just what you oppose. But it creates possibility for dialogue. It reveals common ground. It transforms enemies into potential collaborators. If you've read my book, The Certainty Trap, you'll recognize this. Standing against is how certainty operates, reducing complexity into binaries. Standing for is what the purple middle does. It's finding shared values beneath conflicting positions. When we stand against, when that becomes sort of the dominant way that we deal with issues, we create a world where problems never actually get solved. Problems get weaponized. People become avatars. Anxiety escalates. We're constantly identifying threats without building safety. And then violence increases, first with words, then physically. And in the process of all that, the original issue has gotten lost. And I know this because I lived it. For years, I defined myself by what I opposed. I could articulate everything I was against with clarity and passion. But when I was asked, what do I stand for? What I was trying to build, what kind of world I wanted to create, I struggled. Standing against, I realized, was causing me my humanity. Every person who disagreed had become a problem to solve rather than a human to understand. The breakthrough was not what am I against, but what am I for? When I began to think that way, things changed for me. So standing against draws battle lines, right? We say things like, I'm against police violence. I'm against illegal immigration. And what that does is that identifies enemies. And they're not inviting people into conversation. Standing for extends invitations. I'm for accountability in law enforcement and dignity for all people. I'm for secure borders and humane treatment of people seeking refuge. These articulate values, not enemies. They create space for agreement while allowing disagreement on approaches. Want to see what this looks like at the scale of transforming a nation? The week I'm recording this, we had just celebrated Martin Luther King Day. And I was thinking about Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, I Have a Dream. In that, he says, I have a dream, a vision, not I'm against segregation. Listen to what he says. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. He says, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. These aren't statements about what he's against, they're visions of what he's building. King absolutely named injustice, segregation, discrimination, brutality. He spoke truth to power with devastating clarity, but he didn't make his enemies the center. He made his vision the center. Standing against would have sounded like, I'm against white supremacists. I'm against segregationists. It's true, it's powerful, but creating permanent enemies and immovable battle lines in the process. Instead, King stood for the beloved community. He stood for justice and dignity for all. He stood for judging by character, not by color. This creates space for people to join. Even people complicit in segregation could hear that vision and say, yeah, I want that future. I think this is the key insight. When you stand against something, it always ends with you standing against someone. The against becomes personified. The issue becomes an avatar. You're at war with people, not working on problems. But when you stand for something, the beloved community, the table of brotherhood, you create a vision that can include even opponents if they're willing to change. That's not weakness. That's strategic genius with moral clarity. King kept the dream at the center. He stood for something so compelling, it eventually moved a nation. That's why we still quote those words 60 years later. Not because he identified enemies well, but because he articulated a vision that we're still trying to build. So let's go back to Charlie Kirk and Renee Good for a moment. Standing against when Kirk is shot, people say things like, this is what happens with violent leftists, or before we make him a martyr, remember his harmful ideas. And then when Good was shot, we hear people saying things like, state violence against activists is fascism, or she was interfering, the agent did his job. The shooting itself, in both of those situations, has become secondary to tribal warfare. Standing for. I stand for the sanctity of all human life. When Charlie Kirk was shot, it was a tragedy. And when Renee Good was shot, it was a tragedy. I stand for a society where people can express ideas without fear of violence. And I stand for accountability when anyone uses violence unjustly. And these values apply equally. This is clarity about values that transcends tribal allegiance. It makes it impossible for either tribe to recruit you. It reveals hypocrisy and invites both sides to consider shared values. It shifts from warfare to the actual issue. After testing this framework, I've arrived at a sentence. When we stand for our values, instead of against our enemies, we invite collaboration instead of creating warfare. Standing for your values means clarity and courage about what you're working toward. And it does take courage. I spoke to a friend just this week, and she told me that the thing that she's afraid of more than anything is that if she tries to stand for something and reaches out to the perceived enemy in love, her own tribe is going to turn against her. Because standing against your enemies means defining yourself by your opposition. And when it dominates, though, every issue becomes battle. Every disagreement becomes an enemy. Every tragedy becomes a weapon. Inviting collaboration happens when you articulate values clearly enough that people with different positions recognize shared concerns. Creating warfare is what happens when positions become tribal markers and the goal becomes victory, not solution. So this week, try this. Step 1, write 3 to 5 things that you stand against. All right, and then step 2, for each of the things that you wrote down, ask yourself this question: what value am I protecting? Find what you care about beneath the opposition. And then step 3, craft a for statement. So, for example, I'm against police brutality can become I stand for accountability and dignity. And then step 4, test them. Test these statements, right? Could someone who disagrees on policies still recognize a shared value? Do these new statements invite conversation? And then practice for 1 week. When tempted to attack, pause. Reframe as a for statement. And notice, right, is there less engagement? Probably, especially on social media because outrage gets likes. But is there better conversations? I think probably, because you're creating openings. Are you less anxious? Probably, because you're starting to build something, not destroying. So here's why I think this matters. We live in a world rewarding us for standing against. Algorithms boost outrage. News amplifies conflicts, but it's costing us everything. The binary is killing us. Standing against maintains it. Standing for is our way out. Not because it eliminates disagreement, but because it creates conditions where disagreement can be productive. Yeah, this is going to be hard work because it is. It's way easier to identify enemies and attack. I have to fight against it all the time. But easy isn't wise. And we can't afford easy anymore. Standing for, it requires courage to articulate values, remain open to people who disagree, build bridges when everyone builds fences. Because when we stand for our values instead of against our enemies, we invite collaboration instead of creating warfare. That's not just better. It's the only way to actually make progress. So where do you need to shift from against to for? Try the practice. Notice the changes. Keep practicing. One person at a time, one conversation at a time, one for statement at a time. I think the work is worth it. I think that you're worth it. And I think that the people that you're in conflict with are worth it. So let's get to work.